Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today is a roundtable with some really creative people. The podcast we will discuss is Music, Creativity and Mental Health with William Fitzsimmons. Our very experienced and insightful participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life, or wherever you get your podcasts. But I'll do a quick summary now before we go into our Q&A. William Fitzsimmons is a musician, singer and songwriter, and in our wide-ranging and very lively conversation, topics discussed included the relationship between severe mental health issues and addiction and creativity, otherwise known as the myth of the tortured artist. Suffering as a normal part of life that provides stimulus and content for creative communication. The joyfulness of the creative process. Creativity as time, experimentation and process, not magic. The role of egolessness and intrinsic motivation in creativity. The ways that our culture of the music industry burns people out. The healthy drive for perfection or the creative chase. The central role of intuition in creativity and music as therapeutic pointing. And finally, the centrality of communicating feelings and emotions in music. So you can see we covered a lot. I really enjoyed this conversation, and likewise, I'm really looking forward to discussing it with my friends at Network Music who have so much experience pertinent to these topics. All right, and so I bring you to these promised friends from Network Music. Welcome, everyone. Are we all well? I think it's Halloween, is it not?
Indeed it is.
And some of you are going to be rushing off to dress up in very strange ways. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what parents do. Grandparents might not, but parents do.
Fantastic. Well, here in Australia, it's not such a tradition, but it's becoming one. So yesterday, kids were terrorising the neighbourhood, and parents were dressed in very strange ways, and there was a lot of laughter and hilarity. And I think, just observing, that it was also an excuse for people to drink a fair bit of alcohol. Is this correct? Is this part of the tradition?
Not really here. Here it's just that the candy companies have it wrapped up.
Oh, that's true.
I think if you're in your 20s, it's a very much an excuse.
It is. It's
Yeah,
like
that's
like
what
the
I was
Friday,
thinking.
Saturday Monster Mash parties.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. All right, but more to our topic. A wonderful conversation with William, and given your varied expertise in the music industry, working with musicians, I'm just really interested in your observations and questions and so on. So who would like to kick this off?
I think I can start off on this one, seeing that I've dealt with tortured artists for quite a long time.
Yeah.
What I really liked about it was like a phrase that was from Sufjan Stevens. Words are futile devices.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a profound statement. And he's very much a tortured artist. I think William's been tortured in different ways. A lot of it's been self-torture. And I think a lot of artists actually are self-tortured. So a lot of it's their perspective and the silent thought versus, I would say, outside forces, because there's not as much outside forces to drink and party and do drugs, and it's not that it's not there, but it's not the driving force of creativity. So
No.
it's you like get that in the biops of big bands, but it's the reality is for 95% of the rest of the music industry, that's not a driving force. So is that the aesthetic truth within this? So I mean, it was just a fascinating conversation that really wove everywhere, right? And William's
Yeah,
been around long enough that he's seen a lot, right?
exactly. And of course, he's got his training and background in clinical counselling, and so you know uh, he's processing at that level also what he's doing. So I remember, in the conversation, uh, he mentioned seeing his therapist. Do you remember that section? And he got cranky at the therapist because she asked him, was he deliberately making himself upset to sort of drive his art? And he realized that probably as a younger man he was.
Yeah.
And, but he recognized that this was actually counterproductive, that he was buying into that mythology. But then I guess the other point here is that, and we discussed this at some length, that you don't have to manufacture suffering in life. Like it's going to pay you a visit on more than one occasion, but there's a difference, I guess, here in aesthetic creativity and perhaps more general forms of creativity.
Yeah.
Because in aesthetic creativity, in this case music and singing and songwriting, you're largely about communicating emotions or communicating the aesthetic feel of what it is to be human. And in those terms, we all want to understand our own suffering. And of course, if artists can, or poets or visual artists can give that some expression, that's gold for us, isn't it? It's there's something profoundly valuable about that. So I think in our conversation we talked about that it's kind of subsequent. It's the reflection on and the pulling apart and then trying to give it expression, rather than one creates whilst in an extremely upset state. Yeah. But I remember a long time ago, Terry. You and I were in a program for up and coming music managers, and you were in Australia actually, and you gave a talk, and you talked about the centrality for music is the communication of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Yep,
and the business is the monetization of that emotional connection.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
And that basically, songs are not lyrics. Of course,
no,
they're emotions. I mean, my fellow networkers have heard me say this ad nauseum, but we are in the business of working emotions, and you always want to try and work with emotions that are going to help people through difficult situations. And if you can make those songs big, you are effectively saving lives. So if you want to be in the music business and the parents wanted them to be doctors and save lives, you can be in the music business and save lives. You don't need to be a doctor to do it.
It's very interesting, because I guess in a way we're talking about the in a sense the therapeutic benefits of music there, right? And when I was talking to William, especially, I think earlier, I can't remember whether it was in the interview or before, I was quite a very keen musician earlier on, and I went the therapy way. He was a therapist and went the music way. But in what you're saying there is that in some ways there's quite an overlap.
There is.
If I think about therapeutic process with people, it's facile to say it's an emotional business, but it's more true to say that there is a certain kind of shared emotional experience when therapy is working well. Yes. Where a problem's not necessarily solved in any sort of cognitive way, but the person just moves on. There's a level of understanding or acceptance, and the problem becomes less problematic. And that's a bit of a mystery, just as I think the aesthetic arts are a bit of a mystery in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Wonderful point, Terry. Okay, guys, let's see if you can match Terry's insights and no pressure.
Well,
It's like Chris.
I'm not sure I can match Terry's insights and pressure,
That was
but
that was really mean of me. Sorry.
the as a longtime listener, longtime caller to the Dr. Chris School of Wellness and Creativity, what I found really, really interesting about this conversation was that it was an encapsulation of so many of the different things that we've talked about over the years as a group and that you've talked about. And some of the things that like I know and I've heard, but also act as a really nice reminder. Um, it's also kind of riffs off of where you and Terry were just speaking about, but the idea that you don't need to be this tortured artist in order to create great art, great music. What you just need to do is do it and do it without judgment. And that to me is like always like a ping of realization because it's so easy to just be in something and be like, oh, this isn't good at all. And just kind of moving on and not letting yourself just make something for the sake of making it and making more and more and more of it for the sake of making it. And eventually, that 1 in 1,000 is something that is good. And that's then where you kind of lean in. But, you mentioned something to that effect. And so did William in that conversation. And it was just like such a poignant reminder to get out of, my own way in a creative way whenever I'm in that mood or in that spot, or whether it's work or whatever, and just do it for the sake of doing it and enjoy the process of doing it. It doesn't have to be this like, is it good enough?
Yeah.
Process.
Okay. Very rich. And there's a number of thoughts that occurred to me. I don't know whether I'll recall them all, but I think I love talking to William because I had this sense that he has what I would call ego strength, but he's not egotistical at all. So if we unpack that a little bit, I came across a concept recently that I hadn't come across, as part of doing a post on humility, and this concept is a thing called appreciative humility, and as distinct from a sort of self debasing humility. And the idea is people with appreciative humility, they've actually got pride in what they've achieved, but they still are humble and they still appreciate others. They recognise that there are bounds to their achievement. And what it does for them is it liberates them in a way, because it helps them sidestep the normal, very pervasive, especially in our cultures, with social media and so on, of social comparison. And William is one of 8 of these interviews I've done so far with the artists, and if there's one commonality that sits there, that one key thing they all seem to have learned is they've had to work really hard to not be constantly be caught in social comparison, which is very difficult when they're following metrics all the time on social media and on streams and so on, which of course you guys would be encouraging them to do. But it's this whole question of, am I doing it with this consciousness that I'm being observed and judged by others, or can I forget myself and just produce in the process? And that, I think, is key. And we know from the research side of creativity that people who do the latter just produce more variants, some of which really fit the ecological niche. Mm-hmm. And that the single best predictor of high creative output in the sense of quality is quantity. And then one of the keys is something that you alluded to, Chris. Then also having the ability to spot which is the quality in all the stuff I've made. Right. And yeah, and I think that capacity grows and grows and grows as a person gets more and more experience. So there's another little piece here, and that's the role of intuition. Intuition's a really interesting thing. It's not only the province of females. We talk about female intuition. Obviously, that's a real thing. But intuition more generally is what some psychologists have called thin slicing. It's basically you can take a thin slice of an experience and almost like putting it on a microscope on a slide, and you can see something. But if there's no experience to thin slice, your intuition's going to be worthless. So artists who work and work and work and work and work and work and work, or anyone who does that in their profession, their intuition is much more likely to be valuable, right? Because of all that context. Anyway, so it's another way of saying that, if you want to be successful, work and work and work and work. But I think it is more than that. It's this kind of also working in this way where I'm freed from this spectre of is it good enough and social comparison. Yeah, big topic that. In fact, it reminds me that I've just started to write, I think, a podcast on what is the ego, and because that's going to be all about these topics. But yeah, so thank you for that, Chris. Pretty good. If we're going to be scoring, it'd be hard to separate you.
I thought we weren't socially comparing.
I know. I'm being really. I'm not practicing what I preach, am I? Who would have thought? Who's next?
Well, a little bit more of the same, but it really landed with me, Dr. Chris, when you said that the research shows that suffering is actually negative to creativity. I had to sit with that for a second. I was like, it's so true. It's the reflection that is where the creativity comes from, which I found fascinating. And then also thinking about like the importance of what that creation is, whether it's the reflection on your own suffering or reflection on somebody who's important to you, seeing them go through a significant event, and then the importance of what they're creating. It's funny because I think about when I was going through the first year of going through a divorce, and my Spotify hours at the end of the year were off the charts, but that was therapy for me, like speaking to what Tim was saying, that how the importance of either the suffering or being able to speak to suffering in that reflection, and then how it translates to folks. So that part just really, really stuck with me.
Yeah. And again, it was really nice talking to William about it because, I think he's got some kids. He's been through a couple of marriages by the sound of it. He's an experienced person. And by that, I mean, he has suffered. But he's clearly not making a big deal about that in the sense of he's not glorifying it. In fact, he wants to understand it. And I think this is a really primary drive for us all. It's like I drive my poor wife insane. You could imagine being married to me. I'm all the time, what's it all mean, Mary? What's it all mean? And it's not a serious question, but it comes from this place where, look, life is difficult and it's a mystery, and we're a curious species, right? Because we are aware, and for example, that this is a big question, but we're aware of our suffering. We're aware of the fact of happiness and unhappiness, and we aspire to more happiness. As far as we can tell, that's not true of any other creatures. So we and I'm not saying we should not be like that. I think we ought to. So we have what I call a kind of emergent capability. So by emergent, I mean it's not necessarily just something that's hardwired into the system, but it emerges. And I think it emerges because we've got this extraordinary consciousness that can actually reflect on our experience, and in that reflection can start to alter the way we operate into the future, right? So this is how we learn from the past. And I think I'm getting back to what you were saying, Karen, eventually. It's this reflexive consciousness that what it's trying to design is, how can I multiply my moods of happiness in the future? How can I be happier? You've gone through a divorce, it's horrible. So what did you do? You spent a lot of time on Spotify listening to...
Sure did.
presumably...
There were a lot of network artists that I listened to, strangely.
Funny that. And, it wouldn't have been a random search amongst those musicians. You would have been looking for particular music, particular philosophies and lyrics, particular feelings that seemed to speak to your experience.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, I found it fascinating to look back after, the course of a year of where we are with streaming, being able to see at the end of the year, what have I been listening to? It was just it was almost like a biography of how that year went. And by the end, I think RuPaul was in my playlists. It was super fascinating, but it really made me reflect and take a look at wow, that was part of my growth, my healing, my therapy,
Totally.
and a direct, people's creation in what they, and coming to that human connection. Then I felt connected with those artists because it was like a shared experience.
Yeah. And that's the therapeutic encounter right there, you see. And again, and it's this reflexive consciousness. It wants to be able to, we go over and over our past experience, try to make sense of it. But not just a cognitive sense, a kind of feeling-based sense, right? And so there's this role, and then there's just something in the last thing you said as well, and that you're not alone, that it's a shared experience. And again, this seems to be a universal thing. There's something about art, for example, where it makes us feel part of something greater than self, something beyond self, that we're not separate and alone. And it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? When even if someone is telling a story and they tell it well, we enter into their world. And there is this beautiful notion, Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Buddhist monk who lived in France, I think most of his latter life, he was Vietnamese origin. He had this beautiful notion of a thing called the interbeing. And it's the idea that, for example, I know you guys pretty well. I think you know me pretty well. And, when we have a conversation now, there's a third entity that's brought into existence. It's the interbeing. And that is our shared, it only takes place when we get together. And any relationship has that nature. And I think there is an interbeing created when we encounter works of art. And again, it's a way of expanding our sense of self beyond the constraints and limits of our past, and allows us to grow towards a future where we can figure out gradually, if we're diligent, how we could live a happier life. So fantastic. I didn't know that about you, Karen. So there you go. There's another little addition to our personal interbeing.
Perfect.
And Colleen, I believe that leaves you.
I think I was really interested when we had heard that you had interviewed 6 or 7 or 8 artists. I was wondering if there was a theme that came up, and I'm not surprised that it's comparisons. And I think the music industry is really difficult for creatives, and I think it's gotten more difficult as it's shifted into an algorithmic, very kind of choppy mathematical in some ways industry. For creatives, I think there are always going to be the artists that do very well with discipline and creating more and more, like you guys touched on. But I think the artist that is always really, I've always been very drawn to is that the sensitive, and I think I agree there isn't a tortured artist, or it doesn't have to come from pain, but I do think that there are some that come from a very sensitive, they have a very sensitive approach, or the way they experience life comes from a very different place than a lot of people. And I think industry can be very difficult for them.
That's a great point. Yes, because I think you're right. I think in the aesthetic arts, there's no evidence that people on average have more clinical diagnoses. But there is evidence that for example, they're going to score higher on traits, personality traits like openness to experience, and higher on neuroticism, in that sense of emotional sensitivity and the frequency and intensity of emotion, right? So, and for aesthetic creativity, you would see that one in particular is going to be important because as we've been discussing, the centrality of emotion, right? So, and then as you say, you put a person like that into this machine that's all about social comparison
and social comparison from their peers, but also from the industry, people that are not creative and are making major decisions, and it's like, okay, not
exactly. And one thing that struck me, of course, because I've been involved with the music industry for a while, is the artists all start young, and they're kids, really, like I don't mean to be pejorative in any way, and again with William, you had that sense that there's obviously been growth over many years, and so it's hard enough finding one's way through one's teens and 20s without having to have these additional stresses and strains. And and then of course there's all the other psychosocial factors, like if they're touring, you've got 4 or 5 young people together jammed in cars and buses and hotel rooms and with each other for weeks at a time, away from their loved one, so there's a lot going on. And so of course there's suffering, and that's different to this notion that one has to suffer in order to be creative. So I think if we can separate those things out, it's very helpful. And in fact, if we can realize that the more we can reduce that suffering, the more creative and the more productive people are going to be. Right? We certainly don't have to worry that there's not going to be any emotional suffering for them to draw upon. And as you say, these sensitive types, I remember another psychologist, I was on a panel once at a big music conference. I think it was called Big Sound. It's held in Brisbane each year. And I didn't agree with what she was saying. She was describing artists as skinless, in the sense that they were so sensitive, it's like they had no skin. And, I had the sense in which she was almost saying that's a good thing. And I was sitting there, I was feeling a bit uncomfortable, thinking, no. I know what you're sort of getting at, and that's what you're referring to, this sensitivity. But we don't want to be promoting this idea that you have to be that vulnerable in order to be creative. Right? If anything, we want to be promoting the message about robustness and resilience. Because it's arduous work being creative. It's what Chris was talking about, the grit and determination and perseverance. And there's plenty of sensitive people who fall by the wayside because they don't have that grit and resilience and perseverance, and they were very talented. Right? And I'm sure music managers would recognise that, have many experiences of that, of great talents falling by the wayside.
Yeah, and the drive hopefully makes them overcome some of those.
Yeah, great point. Yep.
But
there's a guy called Daniel Coyle. He wrote a great book. I think it's a great book called The Talent Code. And what he was interested in is, it's not just not only in the creative industries, the aesthetic industries, but just in general, who becomes really masters of what they do. What are the factors and preconditions? And from memory, he says there's like three things. One is there's this igniting passion. He calls it ignition, but there's this drive, as you put it, that helps people, motivates them to persevere even through the difficulties and put in the requisite hours. William talked in there about teaching his neighbour's kid the guitar, and basically the key lesson he's given the kid is just sit with the guitar for a long, long, long time. That's the key, right? So, but the passion is the thing that will motivate a person to do that, right? The second thing from memory, is the way they practice. And it's a kind of openness, actually seeking, it's a type of healthy perfectionism. They're seeking for small errors or things that are suboptimal that they can improve. So they're always improving. They're on this hunt, this creative search for those gems, those gold nuggets, right? So, but it's driven by this curiosity and passion, not by social comparison, right? So it's intrinsic rather than extrinsic, right? And the third thing, which I think is fascinating and something we haven't really touched on, and we might in our future conversations, is that these masters of whatever the field is, they've always been mentors and coaches and significant others who give them feedback and support them in it. So it's not they haven't done it alone. And so anyway, I think I've taken your question and perhaps gone in a slightly different direction, but the drive, I think, is a really key thing that helps them sustain themselves despite the sensitivity, right? But our job, I guess, and their job and managers' jobs and the industry's job is to create more healthy psychosocial environments around them, and not to cultivate the myth of the tortured artists, which will unnecessarily drive very talented people out of the game. All right, that's probably enough for today. Well, I'm really looking forward to the fact that we've got another 7 of these currently in the bag, and so because you get the sense we've just opened up the questions here.
Yeah.
And I look forward to us drilling into all of the dimensions of this in our further conversations. So once again, thank you. Lovely to see you all. Happy Halloween. And we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.